Today has been indeed a very successful day. We've had very intentional and impact-centered conversation, and now we are going to look at how do we build a better future, but now with the young people at the heart of it all. When you look at statistics, about 40% of the global population will be made up of young people by 2030. I think I'll just start by getting views from each one of you. How do you think we should empower as well as encourage them in order for them to be at the front and center when it comes
on that and create tangible opportunities for upward mobility. Because it's not enough to just have youths be represented. It's important for us to be able to have paths into the future to forge and open even more doors than ever before.
So how to unlearn our silence? I think for me, that is actually very deep, because especially young people within different cultures here within the African continent, we are silenced. Fred, we can start with you.
Yes, so I kind of agree with Emmy that for me, it's not about empowering young people, right? Because youth empowerment, it almost sounds like they're helpless and that young people in Africa don't have agency, right? And I think that in my experience, what we need to do is actually build confidence in young people so that they can take their rightful place without necessarily needing permission from others, right? So if you look at what the Nigerians have done with music, right? It's young people who they didn't ask anyone for permission. They just stepped into their place, and today you see the revolution that has happened. So I think we've had a cultural problem in Africa, which is that we have too much deference for age. And, you know, very often they say, oh, you know, you're too young to do this, you're too young to do that. You know, you're a small boy, you're a small girl. Wait until you grow up. And the fact is we are a young continent. So you cannot be an effective government if you don't serve your largest constituency, which is 60% of the population, young people below the age of 30. You know, you cannot be an effective corporation if you don't understand that 60% of your customers are below the age of 30, right? So it's in your interests as a government, as a company, as any player on the African continent to understand that this segment is actually your most important stakeholder, and that, you know, you're not doing them a favor by giving them a seat at the table. You're actually, you know, giving them the rightful space. And it's also, you know, really a chance to see that young people are the solution to many of this continent's problems. Because young people are more innovative, they're more optimistic, they're more energetic, they are more facile with all the technologies that exist today. You know, all the folks don't know how to use AI. They don't know how to use all these technologies that are going to solve our problems on the continent, right? So we need to flip it from thinking about young people as a problem to the greatest opportunity that this continent has.
Indeed, it is a young continent, and we'll actually come back to what you've actually pointed out on how do we bridge the intergenerational gap, especially when it comes to even leadership in itself. Aya, what do you think are some of the efforts that should be put in place in order for young people to take central role when it comes to both economic and social development?
Okay, can you hear me now? Great. I'll pick up from what Fred said around the cultural revolution, the revolution in music. Everything cool now is Afro, right? To the political revolution, because I agree, we don't need to empower young people because they have been leading revolutions, and I've been part of one in my country, Tunisia in 2010. But I think young people are misunderstood, and that's what we need to do to support them, just understand where they come from and why they want change and how they do change and what sort of activism that they're carrying. Because I think access to knowledge without access to opportunity is access to frustration. And a lot of young people take to the street today because no one listens and because they're frustrated. Tunisia is probably the top 10 African countries with the highest literacy, university system. So the rebels or the revolutionaries in the streets are young graduates and young, student graduates. The 7,000 Tunisians who were recruited in Daesh in 2013, among them my cousin, who was an engineer, they are engineers and teachers, right? But you have the knowledge and you are in a context where you are frustrated because you have no choice between armed groups and dying in the Mediterranean. And I think that's where access to knowledge without access to opportunity is access to frustration. So if we don't understand the drive of young people to do change and then channel that frustration into the positive change that we all want to push for, we will continue to see cycles of youth getting frustrating and doing uprisings. And we shouldn't complain as governments about why young people are on the streets, because you're not listening. Sometimes violence is a language to make you listen to what I actually need. And I mean, I worked in the African Union as the youth envoy, and all I hear from young people is, I can die, especially in COVID-19. I was between 2018 and 2021, and I can die of COVID-19, I can die of hunger, or I can die in the Mediterranean. I do not enjoy basic human rights as a young person. So I think as we talk about opportunities, which is in jobs and skills, in employment, training, and education, it's also the opportunity to be. Just like you said, young people are the opportunity themselves. They're not waiting for opportunity or creating opportunities. And I think that recognition that young people themselves are the opportunity, they have that agency Fred is talking about, they have that power that Emmy is talking about, is the starting point to understand why are we having this population that is buzzing with hunger for change. The second thing, I think, is to answer to them the contradiction of the continent. Why are we the youngest population in the world, better educated, the coolest, the most innovative, the digital power, the numbers, if young people vote together, the voting power, they can vote anyone in and anyone out. And yet, the most unemployed, the most displaced, the refugee, the migrants have a youth face. Why are we nourishing European economies and not able to feed ourselves? Why we have the natural resources and we have the human resources? And these are questions I discuss with young people every day, grapple with. Why are we not getting the justice that we deserve? And I think once we start fixing government, once we start fixing leadership, we can answer to youth on these contradictions we're facing. I would just finish with the intergenerational aspect you brought. Which is something I worked on. My whole mandate was to convince heads of states and government of intergenerational co-leadership, because 64 is average age of African leaders, and 20 is average age of the population. So if we're honest with ourselves, we have a generation crisis, not only a gap. Only 3% of the population is over 60. So if we're not dealing with the transition of power, if we're not recruiting youth into public service, if we're not creating the enabling environment for creation of jobs, if we're not investing in youth startups, if we're not creating the infrastructure, this gap of generation will continue to widen. And the only way forward is that co-leadership. I'm not even talking about youth in negotiation table and youth in decision making. I'm only talking about just the right of diversity, which we were talking about backstage, just the right to be in the room as a young person. So I would say intergenerational co-leadership, a way to, not empower, as we decided not to use that word, but a way to really recognize the agency of young people, that they have the right to be themselves.
From everything that you just said, young people are the opportunity, and looking at the gap that is there even within the intergenerational gap in itself, I think it all goes and stems from leadership, and good leadership for that matter. Fred, I want to bring you in. What role do you see good leadership playing, especially when it comes to creating opportunities for young people? How can we foster ethical and entrepreneurial leaders within the African continent to be able to step up and actually take a seat at the table?
Well, firstly, I think the wise political leaders in Africa will actually leverage young people to drive development. So Rwanda is a good example of that. I remember the first time I met President Kagame at international forums, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And he would show up with all these young people around him. They were his staff. The head of his chief of staff, all his advisors, some of the ministers in this country are very young, right? And so a lot of the development that you see in this country has been driven by young people, right? And so when we look at this success story that you see in Rwanda, it's because young people have been taken seriously, they've been given opportunities, right? So I think leaders need to realize that, as I said, a lot of their problems that they face will be solved by engaging young people, right? To enable young people to develop their leadership skills, we believe in the African Leadership Group that three things need to come together. First is you need to obviously invest in identifying people who have potential, right? People who are they have an extra dose of passion, of imagination, of courage, and resilience. People who can really drive change, right? Find them, nurture them. Second thing is you have to develop the talent, right? And this comes from education, skills development, but also practice. You learn how to be a leader by being a leader. You don't learn how to be a leader by sitting in a classroom. So they must be given real chances to lead. Whether it's in a community, it's in a school, it's in a, we have to even reimagine the entire education system. Today, most education is focused on the teacher as the person who has the power, and the students just sit and listen and they absorb knowledge. But young people need to be teaching. They need to be teaching themselves, they need to be teaching each other as peers, they need to be teaching the teacher, because many young people today know more than the teacher with technology and everything, right? So you need to, and you then start to build a confidence in the practice at a very early age, right? That then allows you to do bigger and bigger things later on. And then finally, you need to give people opportunities, right? To practice this leadership. So, mentoring them, hiring them, investing in their businesses. There should be a youth investment bank in every country that invests in young business, young entrepreneurs, and there should be a requirement that every company should have a certain fraction of its workforce and leadership as people, as young people, right? So these are deliberate ways in which young leadership can be nurtured and not just left to chance. And if we do that, you'll find that many innovative ideas enter government, they enter private sector, and the country will start to change, and Africa will actually capture its full potential. Because the gold in Africa lies in the young people. We need to start mining that gold.
From what you said, just even got me thinking about, then how do we involve young people who face adversities? For example, Amy, you've traveled to refugee camps, you've worked on various humanitarian projects. What do you think should be done in order to integrate the different young people who do not have these opportunities that we're talking about into the narrative of building a better future for the African continent?
Thank you so much. I think it's really beautiful listening to what you have to say, and I think that what's really hard for me is that if you stand outside of the continent, people believe that the entire continent is facing adversity. And so what's very interesting to me, especially as someone who myself, I'm an indigenous woman, indigenous African woman, I'm a former refugee. I was just in the camps in Cameroon about a week ago, in the refugee and IDP camps in the north, and I was seeing a lot of these incredible refugee-led and indigenous-led initiatives, and all of these beautiful styles of leadership that don't necessarily coincide or correspond with what traditionally is seen as leadership, which is what I love about the work that we need to do to really just transform what it is a person looks like in terms of power. We're not what power looks like, but in the end, we have so much of it. And I think what's been, one of the most painful things for me in terms of involving people who are facing maybe the most intense types of adversity, and I guess the most people in some of the most vulnerable positions, is that I think someone said it a long time ago, that if you try to leave young people behind, they will leave you behind in the end. Why do people resort to violence? Why do people resort to doing whatever they can with the resources that they have? Why do people struggle? Why do people become ignored or have to function outside of the system? I think it's because a lot of times we're erased not only in practice and literally our lives, but we're also erased in dialogue, we're erased in conversations, we're erased in spaces. And what's so important about actually engaging and co-architecting our solutions with people who are going to be affected by those solutions in the end, is that that's where true solutions that are fit for purpose and really make a change in the world happen. In Africa, like we said several times, everything seems cool. All of the investors are flocking here. There's so many different initiatives, but the majority of the initiatives that are funded are not African created, and the majority of the funders are not African. So what is happening, and why is our continent and every country being essentially pillaged again? We're essentially being recolonized in a lot of ways, even in conversations about the future. And the way that people try to justify it on the outside by reinforcing these old standards is by saying essentially that Africa does not have the infrastructure, the talent, the understanding, the people even, to really take forward or take advantage of the resources that we have all over here. But that's not the truth at all. The reality is that the people who have the best solutions are not just young people, African people, indigenous people, people who are working in some of the most extreme conditions with incredibly limited resources and do incredible work. One small example that I saw, and that it just made me cry. I've been working with these people for years, and what was so beautiful is that 5 leaders in Cameroon, in one of the refugee camps in Minowao, they got together and they just started planting trees, just with their own expertise and their own understanding, with the knowledge that is here on the continent. And again, I can go on forever about this, but the knowledge, even the knowledge that we have, is devalued in traditional systems. I come from a culture that our language is not written, right? Arabic is my first language, but my indigenous language, it's not written. But people seem to dismiss that in history. And if it's not written, or if it's not framed in a traditional way, or shall we say a Western way, people dismiss that knowledge. Now they've planted hundreds of thousands of trees. Hundreds of thousands of trees, and they've reforested part of the Sahel. Refugees with limited resources. And we're trying to mobilize those resources to those places. How do we involve people who are facing adversity? We have to understand that I guess I'll say it this way. We have to understand that we don't leave them behind. They leave us behind, and we need to actually meet them where they're at. And one of the most beautiful things I've heard is that one of the old commissioners for UNHCR a long time ago, Ogata, said that there are no humanitarian solutions for humanitarian problems. Why is that? Because there are political solutions. There are economic solutions. There are financial solutions. There are educational solutions. So for me, the long and short answer is that we need to stop ignoring the people who are really doing the true work, and we need to start valuing it more. I think one last thing that I'll say, coming from a global health background, is that a lot of the stories that I heard in my training, I studied anthropology and molecular cellular developmental biology at Yale. I got a certificate in global health. I write poetry because I think that you reach people where they least expect to be reached. But when I was in school or in any time that I'm in medical spaces, the stories that are told about true leadership that really change the course of history are never told from here. The Ebola crisis was handled on the continent. And that was leadership on such an incredible level. And people were facing adversity, but they fought through it. So I think one thing is shifting the narrative. The other thing is just including people and understanding that maybe to us, refugees or indigenous people are facing adversity, but to the world, our whole continent is facing adversity. And if we take that same mindset and superimpose it onto not only ourselves, but our fellow people on the continent, then we're just going to be repeating the same struggles and recolonizing ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, if time permits, I'll come back to you to even get to understand the power of storytelling as well as art in actually creating opportunities. To come to you, in your bio, it reads that you are on a mission to actually liberate African women and girls. What does that mean? What should be done in order for us, for the African continent, to create gender equality?
Before I jump into that question, I just wanted to say that as we have very good leaders and examples of good leadership on the continent, and Rwanda actually has the largest public service, youth internship in public service. That's why they absorb a large number of youth in public service. We also have a lot of African leaders overstaying in power, and they should stop extending retirement age. And I think in order for us to move forward to a new model of leadership, we need to address these issues with the new generation. I have focused a lot in my work previously on how do we kick out all the old men from power, literally. At 23, I was on the street trying to end a dictatorship. But I realized that even if you kick out everybody of power, you will always have a vacuum. And you can continue to repeat itself. And we need to focus on the transition of power and breeding this generation of ethical leadership and leaders who truly can deliver the Agenda 2063 and 2030. So I think we shouldn't shy away from saying that when a country does well, they should scale up the solution they found. When they figure it out, let them scale the solution they found. There were a lot of great panel on investment and on trade, and it doesn't make sense to be in a country that has M-Pesa and has digital access, and then you cross the border to another country, you cannot even have a bank account. So I think that's Pan-Africanism and that solidarity and that ripple effect, the same way a ripple effect in youth protesting around the continent, there should be a ripple effect of good leadership and of transition to an ethical leadership. So I think one of the things as well, when we talk of what's the future for African youth, it should be a Pan-African youth. Young people should grow to think not just of Tunisia and Ghana, and no, as a continent, and not our little tiny countries, because the Africa we want should be borderless. So we can't think within our borders anymore, and even our national identity is beyond the borders. So I just wanted to add that on the young people. On the women leadership, I often say I don't fight for gender equality, I fight for the liberation of African women and girls. And I'm trying to build an army of women to take charge or take over the continent. Because it's radical when women support women and women nurture women. I think it's really sad to still live in a world, and there was a panel also on health today, where it's okay to cut the clitoris, it's okay to marry at 9 years old, it's okay to drop out of school because of your period, it's okay to be murdered for family honor. 1 in 3 women go through some form of violence in their lifetime, rape, abuse, and so on. And I'm not even talking about women excluded from negotiation tables or the erasure of women contribution in Africa's development. So if we are talking about a future that is female and that is young and that is African, we have to start addressing those core issues, because it's not just about jobs and opportunities. It's about addressing the issues of the Africa we live today, where it's a struggle to live as a woman, to exist. And I think everybody should be outraged of the reality of African women every day. And everybody should rethink their entire ecosystem if they don't have a gender lens. We were trying to push Fred to claim that he's a feminist, and yes. And I think, I mean, my father has been a feminist, and I always say my father is a feminist by the mere fact that he allowed me to just be, not anything else, to just be. That is a feminist father, that you can exist in this world. And that's what we try to do at Nala Feminist Collective, to have ownership over your body, over your finances, over your inheritance, over your intellectual property, to exist. I think that's the liberation that I'm talking about. And usually when we talk feminism, we always think it's a women issue. But liberation, it means liberation for everybody. Because again, Pan-Africanism, there is no Pan-Africanism without feminism.
Yeah,
Pan-Africanism was led by women and men, and it is important that in whatever future we are envisioning, women have their rightful place, women are at the forefront of leadership in masses. And I dream of the day where we have this army of women, and I tell Mama, Sirleaf and her generation, don't worry, because you left an army of women warriors who will take this continent where she deserves to be, with the feminist men who have the ethical leadership.
Yeah, indeed, so much to unpack from what you've just said, but because of time, I'm just going to take one last round of questions. Fred, I'll start with you. What is the one challenge you see limiting when we're having this conversation of having the new generation of African leaders, and what is the one quality you'd like young Africans to actually have? One of each.
I think the challenge we have is time. We're running out of time. You know, we are going to have a workforce larger than China and India in 10 years. And by the end of this century, we're going to be 40% of the world's population, a young population. So we don't have a lot of time to create opportunities for young people, to create jobs for young people, to solve big challenges in healthcare and education, all these things that happens when a population is growing as fast as it is right now. So the entire world, I know there's a lot of distractions in the world right now, but when you think about the long-term century, this is going to be the African century because of the youth bulge that we have in Africa. And the only question is it going to be a good century or a bad century? But it is going to be the African century. And so what we do with our young people is going to determine not just where Africa goes, but where the world goes, if we're going to be 40% of the world. So what's the great opportunity that I see? Is technology. Technology can be the great equalizer that will allow young people to access skills much faster than ever before, access healthcare. They can work globally. If your government is not functioning well, you can get a job sitting somewhere else, leveraging technology. Right? It opens up the landscape of economic opportunity massively. So if young people need to equip themselves with software engineering skills, data science, cybersecurity. We need to build the technology workforce of the world from here in Africa. And China's aging, India's aging. We have the largest untapped pool of technology talent. Right? This is one of the things that we are focusing on in SAN Technologies, right? Train millions of young people in technology skills. Then that allows them to work globally, earn foreign exchange, create innovative solutions in healthcare and education and agriculture, all these things that we need to solve. And it will allow us to create a new form of development in a rapid pace of time so that we can catch up with that limited time that we have before we can solve these problems.
Ayo, One challenge, and where do you see the opportunity?
One challenge. So we're estimating 1 in 4 people will be African by end of this century. So I will take it more from a policy political perspective. We need to fix the multilateral system, because when we talk of young Africans, it's not only the ones on the continent, but young Africans across the world. And Africa needs a global voice globally. We're the largest bloc of the United Nations, and yet we don't even have a seat at the UN Security Council. I think it is a legitimate question of African youth and youth across the world to how is the United Nations upholding its mission, right? Again, Emmy is more versed in the peace and security issue. But I feel that there is a challenge of the multilateral system, that it's not functioning and it's trickling down to the reality of African youth every single day. And the conflicts we see across the continent, the conflict we see across the world. The opportunity for me, and maybe not surprising, is to have more female leadership in the space. And I think female leadership, because it brings emotional intelligence, it brings empathy, it brings collaboration over competition. It brings also that indigenous knowledge that a lot of panels talked about. And I think that generational support, when we talk of women breeding other women and breeding generations, not only women, is very important for us. I think the Africa I dream of, or the Africa I want, is really to see every young person living with dignity. And all of what also Fred mentioned, technology and everything, I think we need to do all of that with dignity, because everything we have right now at our access can be also exploitative. And I see a lot of young people also suffering within those spaces. So for tech entrepreneurs, for people in the businesses, for people in investment, let's have young people in the room, but also let's have dignity for young people, whatever we're creating jobs for them, whatever we're creating opportunities for them.
Okay. Emmy, you have the last word.
Thank you so much. Of course, I agree with everything that was said. I think what's really important to note is that, I'm from Sudan, I'm from Darfur, right? I became a public speaker when I was 10 about the genocide, and the genocide has not ended. This year alone, I've lost 6 family members since April in Sudan. And it's hard to sit here and talk about that and be able to really say that to all of you without saying that when we speak truth to power, there's a gap between when we speak truth to power and power finally acts. And in that gap, we lose people. What you won't see behind the scenes is that even though we're leaders here and we work together and it's like it's hopeful and it's inspiring, you won't see the behind the scenes where we're totally breaking down because it seems like it takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place. What is the biggest challenge? That is the biggest challenge. I think that it's insane to say that in 2019 the whole world, even Rihanna, was talking about the Sudan revolution. But here we are in 2023 and we're seemingly back to square one. It's like what Aya said earlier, that a lot of times some of the positive things are not taken and championed across the world. And I think that it's really, really important for me to say this, but we need regional solutions as well. And we need to lift up the voices and support the people who are doing the work and not just dismiss it as protracted issues, or as people talk about Sudan, like, oh, Sudan, there's still an issue, or like, the Congo, or all of these other places where people are really trying to do the work. I think if we take our voices together and lift up the voices and the initiatives that are happening, we won't be able to just stabilize the people in the places that need the most support right now, but we'll be able to prevent further destabilization and radicalization across the continent. That's one of the most important things that I can leave you with. And the last thing that I'll say is all about narrative, like you said before. We need to tell the true stories and the real stories of the people who are doing the work and lift up the voices and create more convening spaces like these and more accountability spaces. We need to create a collective responsibility for the continent and a collective responsibility for peace.
Indeed, our voices are powerful.
I stand in solidarity with Sudanese youth as well, and all of the young people going through conflict right now.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed, our voices are powerful. We shouldn't be silenced. There's still a lot more to unpack, but we'll have to leave this conversation here. If we have young people in the audience, a call to action is unlearn our silence. That is the one thing that we need to do. And all stakeholders should work together to bridge the intergenerational gap. Help me thank our amazing panelists who couldn't have said it any better. Thank you all.